Neal Iund here with NIT Sewtechnical. Welcome back to our videos, and we appreciate your patronage and the comments that you've left online, and the questions that you have are always fun for us to answer. We hope that this video will benefit you in terms of adjustments for timings of the Bernina 830, 730, 930 machines. Today we're going to continue with the basic 10 adjustments that we mentioned last time. They're giving a logical order, but keep in mind they must be made sequential and precise. We're going to start today the Bernina 830 showing the basic adjustments of number 6, which is actually the distance between the needle and facial side of the hook, which has to be as close as possible without friction. I've removed the feed dog and I've removed the guard so that you can see into the hook. I'm going to set needle position at center needle position, and as I advance the hook point toward the needle, I want the hook point to be about the center of the needle. And at this point I want to take my fingernail, or in this case I'm using a screwdriver, to see how much distance there is. And here we have a very, very slight amount of deflection into the hook point. The condition that you don't want is to have the needle rubbing the hook, because it will wear on the hook. Also, if the needle is too far away from the hook point, you will have skip stitches. By loosening a screw here, we can then take the entire hook race here, put our finger on the screw in the back, and hold with our thumb the rim of the shoulder of the hook, and then we can move the entire hook back and forth. At the same time, we want to do this. We want to see how much gap we've got, and we'll tighten the screw. That is needle distance. The next adjustment after that is going to be the thread escapement adjustment, which is the gap between the heel of the driver spring and the heel of the hook. And in this case, it's 3/10 of a millimeter. Okay. We're going to set the thread escapement gap with a 0.3 millimeter feeler gauge, which is approximately 12 thousandths or so. And what we're going to do is we're going to gap the distance between the heel of the driver and the heel of the hook. And there's a small gap here. That gap is very important. The reason it's important to maintain a small gap but big enough for thread to go through is if you have too big a gap, then you have a lot of excess play there, and the machine will slam the hook back and forth. It will get very noisy, and it will actually damage the driver. So when we set this, we want to be able to insert the feeler gauge, and it should stay in place like this at its freest position and not drop out by itself. On the other hand, if it's set too tight, then this gauge will actually stand out erect while by itself. So if we have to make the adjustment, what we will do is we'll have to adjust the driver itself by bending the driver. We can bend it in or we can bend it out. And so what we have is we have a couple of tools like these. The factory tools are no longer available, but I make these tools on demand, and they're made of 4130 chrome moly steel, and they're hardened on the tips, and so they're a lifelong tool. They don't wear out, they won't break. So if we're going to bend the driver, on the old driver system, this is made of steel, we're going to hold the driver with one tool like this, and then we're going to take this side and we're going to bend the point of the driver in like that. So the farther out I go, the more it's going to bend. Now the driver itself is a hardened part, but not so hard that we can't bend it. So here we go, and bend that in a little bit, And then when we put this back in, we can go and check the gap. And you can see here now that gap is too tight. Okay? And if it's too tight, thread will get pinched in that. So now we're going to reset it. And it only takes a small amount of movement on that. So here we're going to open it up. And then we'll check it again here. And we're right back to where we were. Perfect. I might note that that the driver itself is a hardened material, as I mentioned, but it's not so hard that it will snap and break, and it can be bent. However, it does take considerable force sometimes, but you have to be very, very careful not to overdo it. The next adjustment is called return motion. It's the gap between the hook point and the left side of the needle, which in this case is going to be set at 2.8 millimeters as shown here on left stitch position. The hook will then first of all be rotated to its far left and dead position, and then we will gauge with a 2.8 millimeter feeler gauge for return motion a gap. Please note that return motion for the 930 is 2.3 millimeters. So if we run the needle down all the way, and then we switch needle position now to the left, we can see then a gap between the point of the hook and the left side of the needle. And in this case it should be 2.8 millimeters. We can look at the return motion gauge and we can see 3 millimeters on one end, and you can see 2.8 millimeters on the other. So this is the latest gauge for the 830 machine. And but anyway, when we want to check this, we want to make sure that our hook is in the far left dead position. I always put my thumb on it to take out any play, and then we can go ahead and insert our gauge very carefully and make sure that we don't have any gap. If we do have a gap, or we have to make an adjustment, what we can do is we can adjust it here on the clamp for the rack. So in this case, what I'm going to do, if I put my finger on the rack and the bearing like this, I can loosen this without causing the rack to roll a little bit one way or the other, because if we that rolling like this, it's an adjustment as well, and it takes out the gear lash between the driver and the rack. So I want to keep that where it's supposed to be, and you can see here that if it's too close, then I can take the rack on this side and I can tap it, and you can see now the hook is moving. And now if we tighten it provisionally, we can then take our feeler gauge and go back and look at it again, and now you can see the distance here is too great. So we have to bring that closer. Again, I'll put my finger here. Then I can take this side of it and I can very gently move that rack back where it's supposed to be. Each time I want to provisionally set the screw, and now we can check that again, finding the far left dead position again of the driver, and we can check like this. And here we have that adjustment is perfect again. That is how we set return motion on a Bernina 830. There are some differences, however, with the 730 machine. Here is a Bernina 730 hook driver. And you'll notice that the gear itself, this pinion gear, is pinned with a pin. And on a 730 machine, you don't have a tubular rack that can be adjusted this way as well as radially for gear lash. The rack itself is square, and there's no adjustment on that rack. So return motion, when it's set, has to be set by removing this pin and then rotate the gear, drill a new hole in the gear, and put the pin back in. We repair and rebuild many 730 Bernina machines like these. So for us, this is not a big deal. But for an average person, it might be a very big deal, especially when you don't have tools like these. So you are welcome to give us a call, and we can do it for you. We're going to check loop lift. And what loop lift means is that when the needle goes to its bottom dead position, and then the needle lifts a prescribed distance in left stitch position, in this case, when it raises to a specific height, the hook point should come just flush with the right hand of the needle. A certain size of loop will be formed, depending on the kind of fabrics that we're sewing in and the type of threads we're using and so forth. But when we want to check loop lift, we'll do it this way. We can open the light cover. We can take our loop lift clamp and our gauge. This gauge, we're going to take a 1.8 millimeter gauge, and we're going to put the clamp on the needle bar. We insert the gauge between the clamp and the needle bar, and we can see the needle bar support here. We're going to set that against the needle bar support. When we remove the gauge, we then, by turning the hand wheel in the direction of motion, the needle will lift 1.8 millimeters. And when we look through here, we're actually able to see the hook point just on the right side of the needle. Now, if I had to set this in an 830 machine, I don't know why I would have to unless I had to change the hook crank. As mentioned in the previous video series, in changing the vertical shaft gear, on the hook crank we leave that first screw snug, finger tight. We can make the adjustment without having the hook crank move the hook back and forth this way. With the needle locked so that the vertical shaft is still, we can actually take the rod or the connecting rod here, and we can pull it, and it will rotate the hook around, and that will cause the hook point to advance this way. Or we can take a screwdriver by applying it against the feed dog coupling here. We can then push the rack back a little bit and move the hook backwards this way. So once we're set, then what we do is carefully go back through the end of the machine, take our clamp off, turn the hand wheel carefully, and then we go to that first screw and tighten it tight. And then we'll go back and recheck loop lift to make sure that the hook crank didn't move. And once we know it's set properly, then we'll go ahead and set the conical screw so that it digs a new burrow into the shaft, a new conical burrow into the soft part of the shaft. Number 10 is the needle height adjustment. A needle height on Bernina machines is always set last, never first. And if you're going to set a machine and you think that the needle height is off, be very careful, because it's likely that the other adjustments might be off, giving you the illusion that needle height is off. So it's always set last. And in this case, we're going to switch the needle to the right hand side, and we're going to take the hook and advance the hook point so it comes just to the right side of the needle so that we can see that it's flush. And when we look through the eye of the needle, this is what we want to see. We've advanced the hook point so it comes to the right side of the needle. If we take the needle eye and divide it into quarters, the upper quarter of the left-hand portion of this eye will be covered by, occluded by part of the hook, right there. That's when it's set perfectly. The height of the needle cannot be set 1 or 2 millimeters up and down. The machine will not perform normally. In order to set the needle height for the machines class 530, 730, and 830, this is done by loosening the screw on the needle bar and adjusting the needle bar up and down. You want to make sure also that the needle bar is not rotated out of position. It should be that the eye is exactly straight forward. when making the adjustment. When adjusting the 930, keep in mind that the 930 is equipped with a basting device, which gives you 5 feed movements for 1 stitch, and on the long stitch device you get a stitch every other feed movement. In order to do that, of course, we have a decoupling clutch on the needle bar, where a pin is pulled out of a hole in the side of the needle bar. So when that pin is in position, it's impossible to change the height of the needle. There can be a little bit of variance there. Besides that, there can be a tolerance stack up, which is typical in any kind of machine parts. Although it's very minor on a Bernina machine because of its precision, it's still necessary to make the final needle bar adjustment with some precision, and this is done by means of using a few different needle bar screws that have varying diameters. These are 2 sample screws. They're called needle stop screws for the base of the needle bar, and they stop the needle at varying heights depending on the variance that you might have for needle height in a 930 machine. In the history of the 930 machine, it has been a rare occasion of the thousands of machines that I have adjusted that I've only had to replace that screw once or twice. This is a special segment and something that I've not taught before. But you can have the machine set perfectly. Return motion, loop lift, and needle height are perfect, but the machine still skips stitches on the left-hand side. The problem is, in those machines, is the hook driver is not adjusted properly, and you can see that this little shiny edge here, and that, by the way, this part of the driver is called the guard, the needle guard, and it keeps the needle from going behind the hook. But this sloped area here is to allow for a loop to be formed. So that, and if this weren't here, of course, then we would actually smash the loop so the machine wouldn't sew at all. You can see the eye is totally clear of that little edge, and we go all the way over to the left side. That edge, the needle eye is partially occluded by this little edge. But because this is so very precise, we don't want to be changing the height of the needle, and what we can do is we can rearrange the driver and move the driver down a little bit, and sometimes we have to move the heel out to get our 3/10 adjustment. But that brings that edge down a little low enough so that only half of that needle eye is occluded. But if it's too high, that edge will collapse the loop and you'll skip stitches on the left-hand side. And that should conclude the 10-point adjustment. And if you follow these adjustments in the logical order that they are given, every machine that you work on, if you apply these principles and you work with precision in the adjustment, every Bernina machine will function perfectly. It has been in my life a great pleasure and honor to work with a product that's the highest quality product built from the 30s, from the first Bernina machines all the way up through the 930 series, which are, of course, these are the mechanical Swiss-made machines. And if you do your job, this machine will make you look like a genius, even though you may not be one, but it will create confidence with your customers, and you can always walk away knowing that this machine is going to perform well. Thanks for being with us on this 10-point adjustment sequence. Just remember that it's important to do these things sequentially and as perfect as you possibly can. We'll see you next time.